They call it the news. It's meant to inform you. But do you ever really feel informed? Here, we look for the signal in all that static. I'm Caesar, and welcome to Strange Frequency. And a good night to the coffee drinkers and night owls, and I hope you are having a good night. Caesar here is having a pretty good night. Thinking about the old days, reminiscing about better times. Not that long ago, really. There was a time when politics was just background noise. You checked in during elections, maybe caught a debate. You could hear your parents and uncles kind of arguing about things, the Republican, the Democrat. Who gives a shit, right? But, back then you just went back to your life after that was over. Most young people didn't care, not deeply, certainly not personally. But then something shifted around the late 2000s, early 2010s, and I can remember exactly where I was at the time when it started to shift. Working for a photography lab. So around that time, politics didn't just become more visible, it became more personal. And according to research from Pew and other institutions, political polarization in the United States increased sharply during this period. The divide between parties widened, not just in policy, but in perception. People didn't just disagree, they began to distrust, then reject, then define. And it goes hand in hand with social media expanding at the same time. Platforms grew, algorithms improved, content became faster, more targeted, a lot more personal. At least that's how you felt like it was. Political content wasn't just information anymore, it became identity signaling. What you believed started to reflect who you were, and more importantly, what group you belonged to. Because you got to remember, if we can be lumped into groups, we're a hell of a lot easier to control, right? For younger audiences, this shift hit early, formative years. Now included constant exposure to political narratives, not occasionally, but daily. And over time, those narratives weren't just consumed, they were internalized. So here's what we know. When belief becomes identity, it stops being flexible. You don't just hold the idea, you defend it. Because challenging the belief feels like it's challenging you. And that behavior changes. Conversations become confrontations. Disagreement becomes disrespect. And curiosity gets replaced with loyalty. Now, layer in systems, layer in media, institutions, platforms. They don't benefit from neutrality, remember? They benefit from engagement, and engagement is strongest when emotion is involved. All the big ones: anger, fear, validation, outrage. So what gets pushed? Not calm discussion, certainly not nuance, but conflict, simplified positions, clear sides, because sides are easier to sustain and easier to monetize, especially in younger users. Because once identity forms early, it tends to stick. You don't revisit it often, you reinforce it over and over. Through content, through community, through repetition, and eventually you're no longer evaluating information, you're filtering it again. Keeping what aligns, rejecting what doesn't. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit. And that's the shift. Politics didn't just become more important, it became embedded, woven into how people see themselves. And once something becomes identity, it's no longer just a conversation, it's a boundary. And that's our opening signal. that first segment was a doozy, wasn't it? You can think about moments in history and life and just kind of feels like that was the change. That was the start of the fall, I think. The start of the major just social division started then. Before that, politics was boring as shit. We didn't care. We didn't want to know. That was naive in and of itself. But anyway, there's an assumption that people believe what they believe because they've carefully thought it through. They've weighed evidence and arrived at a conclusion. But is that reality? In reality, most beliefs don't form in isolation. They form inside systems like workplaces, social circles, and media environments, all of which carry incentives that aren't always obvious, but they're always present. Research and analysis of media and institutional behavior show a consistent pattern. Alignment is rewarded, consistency is safe, and deviation carries risk. In professional environments, stepping outside the accepted narratives can cost credibility, opportunity, and access. Have you ever been in a place where you've worked at where you know what's going on isn't correct, and if you say something, there's no chance you're getting that promotion? Probably most adults have been in that if you have any integrity. And if you haven't been in that situation, then man, tell me where you work at. I'd like to come sign up. In social environments, it can cost relationships, status, and belonging. Over time, people learn this pattern, not consciously, but through repetition. Stay within the lane, repeat what's acceptable, avoid unnecessary friction, because friction has consequences. So here's what we know. Independent thinking is often praised in theory, but in practice, systems rarely reward it consistently. Instead, they reward predictability, stability, and alignment, because aligned individuals are easier to manage, categorize, and anticipate, especially at scale. In media, aligned voices are amplified, not necessarily because they are correct, but because they are reliable and stay on message, stay on point. In institutions, agreement maintains structure, reduces disruption, and keeps processing moving. For individuals, the calculation becomes simple. Is it worth challenging the system if it risks status, opportunity, and the dreaded isolation? For most, the answer is no, even though I would argue that isolation can be an amazing thing for any individual to help bring back clarity and find balance. So people adjust, at first subtly, then more consistently, until what they say publicly and what they think privately begin to separate. And over time, even that gap can close, because repetition reinforces belief, not just for others, but for yourself, if you get caught in that loop. This is the mechanism. Not forced control or direct orders, but subtle, very subtle, pressure through incentives, consequences, and social reinforcement, guiding behavior without needing to demand it. So when you see alignment, consensus, and uniform messaging, the question isn't always, is this true? Sometimes it's, what are the incentives for this to be said? Just something to think about as you go through your daily life. Tonight, the mug, bone broth, because we need some clarity. It's been a long, long night. So, across the United States, over the span of years, young men have gone missing, college aged men, often after a night out, bars, parties, social settings. Then they disappear, and days later, sometimes weeks, they're found in water. They're found in a river, lake, creek bed. And in many of these cases, there's a pattern investigators have pointed to: graffiti, a smiley face, always nearby. Law enforcement, in most cases, rule these deaths as accidental drownings. Alcohol involved, disorientation, fall into water, case closed. But some investigators disagree. They tracked dozens of similar cases, same demographic, same circumstance, same outcome. And in multiple locations, similar markings, smiley faces. Now, to be clear, this is not an officially recognized organization. There's no confirmed group, no arrest tied to a network, but the pattern has kept the theory alive. So here's what we know. Humans are pattern seeking. We look for connections. Sometimes we find them where they don't exist, but sometimes patterns are dismissed too quickly because acknowledging them creates problems. It creates longer investigations, it creates more uncertainty and more questions, and it drags the family along for longer periods of time. And systems, like law enforcement, don't always like open questions, so they default to the simplest explanation. Accidents, missteps, case closed. And often, I think often varies, so sometimes that's correct, but not always, because when multiple cases share the same profile, the same environment, and the same outcome, you have to at least ask, is this coincidence or something more structured? And that's where this sits, right on the edge, not proven, not dismissed, just unresolved, which is uncomfortable. I get it, it's uncomfortable for the people investigating, and it sure is for the families as well. Because unresolved things don't give us closure. They don't give us clean answers. They sit in the background, and they force a different kind of thinking. Not what's confirmed, but what's possible. So when you hear about these cases, it's not about jumping to conclusions. For me, and for you all, it should be about recognizing the patterns and asking better questions. At what point does coincidence start to look intentional? Something to think about. And that concludes tonight's broadcast. As always, links to the articles used will be in the description below. And if you have anything strange or unexplained, put it in the comments. Please like and subscribe and share this with your friends. Until next time, we'll keep listening for the signal.